John, you're a senior associate at Lewis Silkin firm in London and sports lover, and you work exclusively in the sports sector, advising clients, some Premier League football clubs, agencies, and international athletes. We're in the middle of very unusual times for sport and football as well. You wrote a detailed piece on love in sport. But let me ask you, currently, what is the biggest legal problem faced by English football?
Wow, that's a very big question. I think,
or the ongoing season, what might be the biggest problems?
I think there's probably two main things at the minute from a legal perspective in football, for football clubs. The first one, well, they're both kind of related to player contracts. The one is probably the most pressing issue now is regarding player salaries, and clubs who are looking to cut costs are looking to sustain and keep the whole of their employment staff, not just the playing staff, but also all of their employees, trying to, whilst the clubs are not trading effectively and not generating any income, they need to maintain, have enough cash essentially to pay all staff and to keep the business going. And so they've been looking to agree or defer salaries or to cut salaries for players. At the minute, that's certainly an issue for clubs to try and get agreement from players to do that, because they can't unilaterally necessarily just reduce salaries of players in order to sort of sustain their income. So they've needed to reach agreement with their players as a whole to do that, or in conjunction with the Players Football Association in order to seek agreement from them as a collective to do that. So that's one legal issue that clubs are dealing with in the current climate. Kind of linked to that from a player contracts perspective, the issue with the extension of the season is that players whose contracts are expiring on the 30th of June, the position is what happens after that. So if the season extends into July and August, what happens to those players? And now FIFA have suggested in their guidance that they issued last week that those contracts should be extended to cover the extended season. And similarly, those contracts where some players would now have already reached agreements to join clubs on the 1st of July already. So players who have their contracts expiring on the 30th of June have already agreed to join another club on the 1st of July. What happens then? Are they going to be allowed to join their new clubs? Or what should happen to them? Should they be extended? Now, FIFA have suggested that what should happen is that the contract of their current club should be extended again to cover the extended season, and then once that season's ended, then they join their new club, which makes logical sense. But for all sorts of reasons, players or clubs might not want to do that. For instance, a club might be struggling financially and might not have budgeted for paying an extra salary for another month or two, and so they might not want to extend the contract of the player. On the flip side, a player might not want to, extend his contract because he said, well, no, I've agreed to join this club on the 1st of July. I don't want to risk perhaps getting injured during those 2 months, and then my move to my new club is going to be jeopardised. So FIFA or any governing body cannot force parties to extend contracts. So that's still an issue which is still, open to be decided. It's one thing suggesting that contracts should be extended, and in the large majority of cases, it's going to be in the best interest of the club and the player to extend the contract and just wait till the end of the season and push push things along. But there are going to be cases, I'm sure, where clubs and players won't do that.
FIFA guideline being on a national level.
It's only guidance. It's not binding. It's a guiding set of principles. That's what they are. And I think as a collective, given the unprecedented situation that we are all in, everyone needs to be working together to form a solution to all of these issues. And I think the consensus amongst clubs, associations, players is generally good, because everyone appreciates that we're involved in a really difficult situation here, and no one wants to be difficult, and everyone should be working together to try and form a resolution. So I think FIFA's aim is that these set of principles are, whilst they are not binding necessarily in terms of particularly in respect to the player contract side, they should be. I think FIFA hope that clubs and players will work together to ensure to follow those principles. Nevertheless,
in England, I think League and Football League died on the period of transfer window. Am I wrong?
Sorry, in regards to the transfer window, I mean that's another issue again, because in terms of the player contract. So, for instance, if a player decides that he doesn't want to extend his contract beyond the 30th of June and says, no, I want to join my new club, what's going to happen? Will he be allowed to, from a legal perspective, he's certainly able to join his new club from in terms of an employment side. He can just sign a contract of employment and that's fine. But will the transfer window open on the 1st of July, for instance, and enable him to be registered for the club, for his new club, and will he be able to play for his new club before the season finishes? Now, my understanding from FIFA is that the transfer window is not going to open on the 1st of July, which is another incentive for players not to refuse to extend their contracts, because there's no real point you can see for a player to join a new club on the 1st of July if he can't play until the end of August. What's the real driving force behind that? And if he can't play, what's the point? So that's what I said. It's really in players' best interest to extend their contracts. Where there could be issues, I think, from a legal perspective, is if it's the club who refuses to extend the contract, and then the player is then left in limbo, because if the club refuses to extend the contract, the player's contract expires on the 30th of June, and he can't join a new club because he can't be registered. That's where I think there could be issues for players, certainly. In a period of uncertainty where they won't be earning income and they won't be playing football.
Can Premier League extend the national transfer window? I mean, beyond September or more?
Yeah. So as part of the guidance from FIFA, they said that they will in principle approve any requests from member associations to change the transfer window. So at the minute it's all uncertain, but as long as the length of the transfer window remains in compliance with the FIFA regulations, which from memory I think it needs to be a maximum or minimum of 16 weeks. So as long as it's consistent with the length of the FIFA regulations, then FIFA will just approve whatever the member association decides on the date. So if it would all depend on when the season comes back and when it finishes and when the new season starts. So it's just a case of where the window is going to be fitting in, basically. So obviously the longer the season extends to, then obviously that will push the transfer window. I think the idea is that the transfer window will only open once the season finishes. I think that has to be the case, because from a sporting integrity perspective, you can't have players, in my view, and I'm sure FIFA shares the view, you can't have players joining clubs at the end of the season and being able to play 4 or 5 games and can really influence sort of the final part of the season. So I think the transfer window can only open at the end of the season, and then it's just a question of when it's going to finish. And given that I presume the pre-season period is going to be truncated more so than in normal years, I would suspect that there's going to be perhaps a larger period of the transfer window being open during the beginning of next season. That's my guess. So perhaps we could have a transfer window lasting from maybe the beginning of August to middle of September or something like that, perhaps.
Yeah.
But that's just my guess.
It's a very unusual year, and there might be an unusual transfer window. Let me understand. In that case, legally, is any player entitled to reject any short-term extension or renewal? Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Yeah, a player can do that. There's not under English law, a party, you can't compel someone to a contract. So a player, like I said, the player can refuse to extend, and similarly, a club can refuse to extend the player's contract. But the hope is that most people, I mean, like I said, it's in players' and clubs' best interest to extend. I mean, clubs on the whole would not want to lose players for the final part of the season, and players won't want to move to clubs if they can't play. So it's in their best interest to continue. But I'm sure there are going to be instances where clubs and players refuse to extend, and then then there might be sort of issues there in terms of what happens then, and there might be disputes regarding that. But generally speaking, on the English law, you can't force someone to into a contract.
As far as I get it, there might be some disputes regarding the expiring contracts. The outcome of the current season, both in Premier League and English Football League, is not yet decided. There is even a possibility of declaring the season void. In that case, that means the players might not get some of the bonuses they could have if the season had ended in a usual way. Could the players still ask for the bonuses?
Well, there are so many unknowns regarding that. It's all going to depend. It's going to depend on 2 things. First of all, it's going to depend on the outcome of the season. So, I mean, if it's declared null and void, and therefore no one wins anything, no one stays up, no one qualifies for Europe if such, no one gets relegated. It will all depend then on the wording of the contract and how the bonus clause is drafted. One example, for instance, where you could foresee disputes is that, for instance, I've used the example before of European qualification. So let's say, this is just an example, but the season's declared null and void. And in terms of qualification for UEFA competitions for next season, it's based on the last season's results. So for instance, I think Tottenham are not qualified they will qualify for the Champions League, but they're not currently in the Champions League places. But they would have qualified for next season's Champions League based on last season's results. And the players have a contract where it says, in their contract, it says you'll be entitled to a bonus in the event that the club qualifies for the Champions League in whatever season. From a literal perspective, the club has qualified for the Champions League, and therefore the players would be entitled to the bonus. But you might see a situation where a club in that instance, I mean, a club would presumably likely to honour that because the club would receive greater income because they've qualified for the Champions League. They've got the income as a result of that, and therefore they probably won't have any complaints in paying out the bonuses. But some clubs might not pay out bonuses in that instance, and in which case then you can see disputes arising between players and clubs. That's one example. Another example is for instance a safety bonus. Clubs who have perhaps I can't remember now. It's been so long. I can't remember who's in the relegation zone. Norwich, perhaps. Norwich might be a good example. I think Norwich are in the relegation zone at the minute. But if they end up staying up by default, if they've got players who've got safety clauses in their bonuses in their contracts, again, you've got the same situation. So it's going to depend on what happens with the season, how it's going to be determined, how all the place is going to be determined, and then subsequent to that, it's going to depend on the contractual wording.
As today, an agreement between PFA and Premier League clubs, but some clubs are negotiating individually with their players, and we've seen this morning that Arsenal were able to negotiate 12.5% wage reduction with their players, depending on their probable qualification to Champions League or Europa League. Would you suggest to clubs, all the clubs, to negotiate with their players one by one or as a group for deferrals or wage reductions?
Yeah, I think that's I think doing it on a one-on-one basis is very difficult, and you're just going to run into difficulties if you do that, because you're going to get issues with one player sort of saying, well, how come one player perhaps is taking more of a deferral, more of a pay cut than others? So absolutely, I would recommend that it's done on a collective basis, and I think every club is doing things differently and individually in their own ways, and it depends on the club's circumstances.
Yeah. And do you expect or many disputes between players and clubs in all four professional leagues in England? Will both parties find a way to reconcile in the coming months?
I think on the whole, I think most of the parties are going to come together to work together to find solutions. As I said before, I think everyone appreciates that we're in such an unprecedented and difficult situation. I think even players appreciate that clubs are in difficult positions, and clubs appreciate that players are in difficult situations as well. So everyone, I think, appreciates the situation, and are going to, on the whole, come together and work to find solutions. But there are going to be exceptions to that, and I am sure there's going to be disputes between clubs and players regarding pay issues, regarding contractual issues, regarding extensions, and regarding bonuses. I'm sure that's going to happen. Not just in this country, but across across Europe, across even worldwide, and also there might be disputes between clubs and clubs, I'm sure there's going to be issues regarding contractual issues, regarding transfers and other agreements where particularly where clubs are struggling financially as a result of this crisis. There's going to be, parties are going to look at ways to try and excuse themselves from performing contractual obligations somehow, and use perhaps COVID-19 as an excuse to try and get out of contractual obligations. So I envisage that there's going to be a lot of disputes down the line, and we don't know what's going to happen with the seasons. I think that's something else that actually we haven't sort of considered. At the minute, it's not consistent. Some leagues already have been declared null and void or cancelled, and some leagues have been I think I've seen some leagues where they've been cancelled, but the current standings of where the clubs are at have stood as final standings. So there's going to be a lot of disputes arising just as a result of what happens with all the respective seasons. So yeah, absolutely. There's going to be a lot of litigation, I would suspect.
I have one final question. A couple of months ago, a much different legal case, Manchester City versus UEFA. What will be the outcome? CAS appeal? Did we expect the decision soon?
I think the initial intention of the parties was that what's called an expedited procedure would apply, which meant that I think they would expect a decision to be rendered by midsummer, around sort of June, perhaps early summer, June, July time. That might have changed as a result of this current crisis, but I think my understanding, and obviously I'm not involved in the case at all, but my understanding is that the parties have agreed to have a video hearing take place. So in which case, rather than all the parties needing to go to Switzerland to have a full hearing, all the parties are now agreed, as I understand it, to have a video hearing. In which case, I still expect there to be a decision in around sort of June or July.
I see, yeah. That means before the start of the new season, there will be...
Before the start of this.
Regarding the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose now in the current crisis, given that the likelihood of next season being, the start of next season being pushed along to probably, who knows when, perhaps, later August or early September, it gives them a little bit more time in order to squeeze the appeal in.
You're right. John, thank you very much.
No problem at all. Pleasure. Thanks very much.